Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I think there might be several people joining later, but we're going to start so that we have the full use of the time available, and hopefully you can catch up by watching later. So welcome to the third topic. This week we're looking at the use of resources. When we think about the use of resources, we want to look at four main actions that can help us in internal control. So that is putting checks in place to making sure that we are using the money correctly and that it is safe, that our resources are safe. So these four actions are taken from the Mango Handbook, which is an excellent resource for NGOs and very useful for in terms of putting financial processes in place. So check that out if you want more information. But these four actions are direct, prevent, detect, and correct. So when we look at direct, that would be putting instructions and procedures, processes in place to make sure that the right actions, that everybody knows the right way to handle money, to request for money, etc. So that would be what we've looked at previously in terms of having policies in place, making sure that the staff know their own responsibilities, and having a consistent process for different finance actions. Then in terms of prevent, to deter the wrong actions, this would be the sort of controls that are put in place to make sure that people aren't tempted by following the wrong actions. So that would be some of what we'll look at today. And then in terms of detecting and correcting, that would be identifying if and where it has gone wrong and putting right the errors or loss detected. So part of that would be making sure that the records are checked regularly, reconciled, and if there are errors in place, that you would know how to put them right, and also how to then prevent them happening again in the future. So we continue in a loop, a sort of circle of those four actions, because by correcting the errors, you might need to add to your directions to make sure that the money is, the process is continuing. So we're going to look at the standards now. There are two standards in this topic. And the first one is there are controls in place for safe handling of cash and banking. These include as a minimum, the cash, checkbooks and other banking details are stored securely. If possible, money is kept in a bank account that is separate from any trustee or staff member's bank account, and any transaction requires the authorization of at least 2 people. All money received is banked in the week it is received. So I know that we looked at some of these things before, but in terms of an internal control, these things make sure that the records are correct and also the resources are safe and secure. So in terms of making sure the cash and checkbooks are stored securely, obviously that includes not storing cash on your premises where possible. So that refers again to the last point there, is all money received is banked within the week that it is received. So you should develop a routine that means that money is not kept for long periods of time without being banked. And the middle point there to say that if money is stored in somebody else's bank account, it becomes harder to separate those funds, and therefore there's more risk of either misuse of funds accidentally or intentionally. So having a bank account which can be reconciled and only the designated people have access to ensures that your funds can be kept safe, and that you can also be transparent when you're reporting either to donors or to stakeholders, or when you're reporting at the end of your year in your annual audit. The one further point to note there about the money in and out, it's really good practice to not use money that you receive before banking it. So if you receive income, for example, if you're receiving payments from people for, let's say if it's a school, for school fees, you should not just put that money into a pot and then use your expenditure out of that. It should be banked first, and then the proper methods of request and authorization for the use of that. Otherwise, there's a risk of not recording all of your income and expenditure, because you could miss out a step there in terms of not recording your income or your expenditure. And that's where the risk of errors come in with not reconciling. The second standard is there are controls in place to manage relationships with suppliers and the use of supplies. So this is a really big topic in terms of how that process is handled, and we can't cover all of it today, but hopefully you'll get some ideas to think about what you need to consider when putting those processes in place. So if we think back to those 4 actions we looked at before: direct, prevent, detect, and correct. When we're thinking about suppliers, we can also apply these internal controls. So for direct, we are going to lay down rules about who is authorized to do what and the steps to follow when making purchases. For prevent, it includes separation of duties. It includes separation of duties principles to share the workload and to minimize the risk of theft or fraud. Detect, it built in checking routines to ensure procedures are followed and the correct paperwork exists. And correct, it allows a review of the process and actions taken so far, and the chance to put things right before proceeding to the next stage. So again, looking at those 4 internal controls, when you're thinking about suppliers specifically, it helps to have these actions, these controls in place to make sure that there is no sort of internal or external misuse of funds, or people, deciding together to misuse that money. The risks, of course, there are if people, a common one, for example, is if people have an agreement with the supplier and will engage them specifically in order for them to get business, and either then the internal person gets a kickback, receives money directly from that supplier, or they benefit in other ways by that person gaining the business. So what we need to make sure happens as an organization is that first of all, that there are multiple people involved in the process to prevent that risk, and also making sure that any staff that are involved in any procurement process have declared any conflicts of interest that they might have, so that if there are people that they could be accused of collaborating with, that they are not involved in that process, and therefore it remains transparent. So it's not to say that people can't do business with people that they know, but it means that they would then take a step back in doing those direct dealings and somebody else within the organization would do that, and multiple people would be authorizing, so that the risk is not there for sort of internal agreements to take place. Again, all of these actions contribute to that, to preventing that risk, really. In terms of separation of duties, it would be making sure that there are several people involved in the process, and that one person is not responsible for negotiating with suppliers for the whole way through, from requesting for quotations to payment and to agreeing on the supplier. And then in terms of those last two actions, detect and correct, that would involve, again, regular checking of paperwork, making sure that there is paperwork in place for each part of the process. That includes request for quotations. If you have a procurement committee, it would be making sure that there are minutes of those meetings, and any decisions that are made would be sort of clear on paper as well. Any scoring systems, any justifications needed, that would all be transparent in terms of paperwork, and that people would have a regular chance to review that, for example, board members or management, if they're not directly involved in the process. So going back to, that's just the second standard again. So just to come back to that standard, there are controls in place to manage relationships with suppliers and the use of supplies. So we looked just then at the relationship with suppliers. And obviously, as I said, that is just a starting point, really. So in looking at those internal controls, you should then consider what your process should look like. Maybe map it out to say, okay, at this stage, these people should be involved. As you go through your process of getting quotations and engaging potential suppliers, who's involved at each part of that process, and who has authority or responsibility for making decisions. Then if we look at the second part of that standard, the use of supplies, again, just to consider how we put controls in place to manage the use of supplies. This is sometimes something that gets lost in how organizations consider their assets, because, for example, if you've already bought something, you might not think through the whole process of how you manage those assets. So in terms of supplies, you might be considering long-term assets, or also short-term, which would be used within a year. In terms of assets, longer term, so larger equipment, maybe computers, vehicles, furniture, that you would need to consider an asset register. And that would include your purchases, and depending on the level of your records, that you might consider depreciation and those aspects with your auditor. But it could be a simple list of your assets, but also to maintain like how regularly they're checked, whether when you record whether there's a fault or a repair needed. So it's also a sort of monitoring tool as well as a financial tool to measure your worth as an organization. In terms of short-term supplies, you would be looking at having maybe a stock book, and also policies and processes in place to make sure that your your resources are used correctly. So for example, when you think about, if we take the example of stationery, ideally you would be, the process for requesting for that stationery would have happened in terms of what we talked about with suppliers. But when you then receive that stationery, you want to make sure that it's not used for, that it's only used for the purposes of your organization, as it were. And so you would want to record receiving that, but also maybe consider having sort of internal controls for requesting for that stationery. So it wouldn't just be that you procure 1,000 pens and then it doesn't matter what happens to them, but you want to see through the whole process. Therefore, you might order 1,000 pens and then a certain staff member might request for 100 of those pens to use for a particular activity. In the case of reusable assets or reusable resources or any leftover resources, you would then receive them back, and that would be recorded in a stock book. Also there, think about what policies you would have in place for example, for staff borrowing assets. Maybe if you had computers, for example, what would your rules be about whether staff could take those home or use them outside of the office? And if you had agreed on that, then you would need policies in place to make sure there was signing out of assets, making sure that they were maintained well when they're not on the premises, and consider even insurance and those aspects. So that comes to the end of our look at those standards. I think we have had a few more people join us along the way, so thank you for joining, and I hope that you managed to get the to join near the beginning, and if not, please catch up by watching the YouTube video. I don't know if anybody has any questions concerning that we've just looked at, or any further comments on their experiences of those internal controls and dealing with suppliers. Yeah, please feel free to share.
Becca, maybe I could start us off with a question.
Mm-hmm.
If you're working in a small organization, or maybe you're working in a school where possibly you only have a bursar, if that, what advice would you give for maintaining these principles when there's not a big staff team and maybe people with limited financial qualifications?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Mim. I think obviously these standards and processes are what would ideally be in place, but of course we recognize that maybe it's not always possible, as you've said, to have enough staff members or enough people in place to make sure those processes are possible. What I would say in those cases is to always come back to the principles really of transparency, and to make sure that if there is only one person available to make those decisions, that they are really recorded accurately. The whole process, as I said before, is recorded on paper as well as in face-to-face dealings, really for the protection of that staff member as well as for anybody reviewing that, to make sure that, for example, if you were requesting for a quotation, I would make sure it was done in writing rather than talking to somebody on the phone or or face-to-face. So you, even if that was an email, for example, just to make sure that there's a record of what has been said and agreed along that process. I would also say that where there's cases of, I mean, I don't know, I'm sorry that I don't know the school system so much, but hopefully you can apply this in your own context. But in terms of an organization with a board, for example, you would still want regular kind of input from that board. So even if they're making every small financial decision, you would want to ensure that they were still regularly checking those records and making sure that the processes were being followed. I would still also ensure that you had sort of policies in place, even if it is one person working on their own, just to make sure that they know their own responsibilities, and that they, again, for consistency, they do things in the correct manner, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I would also say that when you consider, for example, with suppliers, it might be that the board could choose certain suppliers beforehand that they're happy to do dealings with, if you see what I mean, that they decide that these suppliers are going to supply your stationery, and these suppliers are going to supply food for meetings. In those cases, you would still need to sort of negotiate each time the resources needed, and that would need to be reviewed regularly to make sure that the prices were still competitive and good value for money. But it could be that you'd have those agreed suppliers in place. I don't know if either Mim or Frida or anyone else wants to add to those comments there in terms of smaller organizations dealing with suppliers, or if you're happy with that answer.
Yeah, no, I guess the most important thing is to keep evidence yourself. It's there for you, really. So I'm just recalling back maybe 10, 12 years when we didn't know what the word procurement meant. But, you know, common sense says that you will follow some sort of process for choosing and making sure that you keep a record of all those conversations and all those discussions, so that, you know, if anybody questions you, you've got everything. And I have a rule that I never delete an email, for example, just for my own protection, sadly.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, just to make sure that you always have sort of evidence to back up the decisions that you've made, and so that you can you know, explain that process if you needed to at any point.
Anybody else have a question? Humphrey?
Yeah, thank you, Mim. Thank you, Becca, for that wonderful presentation. I just
Thank you.
Have probably two questions in relation to what you talked about. One of them is about handling cash, and we are talking about making sure that all the money goes through the bank before it's used. And I'm looking at scenarios, for instance, in some of our schools that are really struggling, where they might be having a bank account, and their source of funding is basically school fees. And so sometimes parents are not paying in time. And so you find that the school actually has needs almost on a daily basis. So one would ask a question: if the child brings school fees, or a parent brings school fees in the morning, and we have a serious need that needs the school to run in a day, why should I first take that money to the bank if I have it in cash and I can use it immediately there
Yeah.
and then.
Yeah.
That is, that's something. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just answer that question if I can. And then if you have another comment, maybe you can add after. Just to say, like, I understand the sort of realities of day to day in those situations, that it can be really tempting to do so. And I suppose it does depend on a number of factors in terms of how far away the bank is and the process for that. But I would say that it really is good practice to not do so, in, you know, to make sure that there is separation of funds. And the reason that I said that earlier was because it just increases the risk of not recording and reporting correctly. In terms of, if I can give you an example, as you said, Humphrey, maybe if you have school fees that came in, let's say your school fees are 100,000 shillings. If you're watching from another country, obviously apply your own currency there. And then you wanted to buy food for children, say for 50,000 shillings. If you took that money from the school fees, you would be left with a net there of 50,000, as in you'd received 100,000, you'd spent 50,000, you would be left with 50,000 remaining. Now, if you are keeping correct records, it is possible that you could do that and still remain with your correct records. But if you were busy and forgot to write those numbers down, you might end up saying that you're depositing 50,000 shillings and that's your income. So in those situations, as I said, I'm advising against doing that, against using money that your income, that you're receiving as income. But if that situation did happen, it would be making sure that all the income was receipted, so that you're giving a receipt for 100,000 shillings school fees, and then all of your expenditure was similarly recorded and receipted correctly, so that in your records you're reporting 100,000 of income and 50,000 of expenditure, rather than just 50,000 of income and not mentioning that expenditure. And the reason for that is, one, in terms of your budgeting and monitoring of that, you don't want to miss any expenditures that you've incurred, and also in terms of just good use of money and preventing fraud there, in terms of having the availability of money to be spent without the correct procedure, if that makes sense. Because the other point there, of course, is making sure that that expenditure would still follow the correct process in terms of authorization and, you know, sort of comparing against your budget. You're not just spending that money because it's there. I hope that answers your question. I hope it's clear that to see why that's important. And I would say, although I advise against it, that if that situation was happening, it would still be making sure that correct processes are followed, and that in terms of authorization, and that the records are maintained as still separately as income and as expenditure. I hope that answers your comment there, Humphrey. I don't know if Frida has anything to add to that, or anybody else.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Are we together?
Yes, Frida.
Just to add on that, as you have already emphasized, it is really not advisable to spend at source. That's how we normally term it. Receiving money at the same time you spend it. Just that you explained it at the end, that some processes of accessing funds like authorization and approvals may be skipped if at all we encourage people to spend at source. And the other thing is on the point of Humphrey, where I was talking about the bank account and how you can separate the funds. It's true, you may have one bank account according to the size of the organization. But if you do proper bookkeeping and you have codes in your accounts, you can easily separate the funds, knowing that these funds are for school fees, these funds are for lunches, and so on. But it is a good practice for us not to spend at source. So we would encourage us surely to continue with that a good practice. We shouldn't encourage in any way to spend the money at source. Thank you, Becca.
Thanks so much, Frida. Yep, that's brilliant. We've just got a
Yes, 3 minutes.
couple of...
Paul had his hand up. I don't know whether you still have a question.
Hello.
Yes.
I just wanted to emphasize, just like Madam Frida said, that it's not good to spend money at source. However, at times, I'm just going to give an example that if you get an emergency and you really need to either take a child to some health facility, then there is need to have petty cash. Now, in case petty cash was used up and you find yourself having to spend because this child's life has to be saved, then possibly in such a scenario, you'll have to spend before banking, which is not encouraged, yes, but you are saving a life. Then afterwards, you correct the records, you include the requisition on the voucher, and the next voucher that is, then you withdraw the money and replace it, something of that kind. But it is true, it's not good to encourage spending at source. That's what I had to.
Thank you so much for that input there. Yeah, that's a good comment. And what I would say there is, if we look at that that sort of cycle here of direct, prevent, detect, and correct, in that scenario, that might happen in the first instance, and you say, okay, there's no money available, so I have to use this, these funds which have come in. And as you said, in that scenario, you would then go make sure you've made your records accurate afterwards. But then you might say, okay, maybe we need some sort of emergency fund that is available in those circumstances, and how can we put that in place while making sure that the money is safe and secure, and so therefore put those new processes in place to ensure that that might not happen again if in that scenario. We've got less than a minute remaining, so I hope that was clear there. But as you said, yes, if there are instances, it's still just making sure that processes are followed correctly as possible. And you would want to make other people aware that you were doing that, for example, so that you're protected in terms of any accusations there. Okay, so I think we're going to end there because we're about to get cut off. So just to say thank you for joining, and hopefully you can join us again next week. Thanks for all your input.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Becca.